your host, Vocab Malone.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? This is Vocab Malone. Very, very, very special edition here of Backpack Radio. I'm very excited about this right here. We've got an awesome panel with some awesome apologists. And I believe we're going to talk about some very important things, specifically the debate that literally just ended between Mohammed Hijab and David Wood. The date is November 7th. The time is 7:30 here in Arizona. I believe it's 9:30 there, if you're on the East Coast. And I've got a great panel today. But before I introduce them, here's what I need you guys to do. I need you to grab this button, this like button, and smash it. And I also need you to subscribe to this channel as well as the notifications. And I also need you to grab this link and share it. Please do that, and that'll make this a successful broadcast. We plan on doing this live stream for about an hour and a half. Didn't initially plan on doing this, but during the course of the debate, I felt it became incumbent upon me to do so, and a number of other gentlemen agreed as well. Let me bring them now into the live chat with me. Thank you, audience. I see you hitting that like button. Continue to do that, please. Grab this link and share it on social media. Also, you might want to follow along the live tweets that I did. So go to my Twitter page and go at Vocab Malone. And I retweeted all of the men on the panel. Even though Anthony doesn't have a Twitter, I actually would quote text messages he sent to me. And so with that, now let me introduce the panel. I mentioned Anthony Rogers. He is a Christian apologist who writes for AnsweringIslam.com as well as Acts 17 Apologetics. Welcome to Backpack Radio Live, Anthony Rogers. We got him right there. You're still muted there, bro. But that's all right. We'll get you in. And we also have now, of course, my main man, Jeff Cran. What's up, Jeff? How you doing? All right, good. You look good. You sound good. I think we are ready to go. Let me make sure I got the right camera here, and I got everything set up how we need it. Hey, guys, if you're continuing to come in, listen, let me break down the rules here real quick because I know we're going to have a lot of people, and I know some people are triggered. So I'm going to break down the rules, and I'm going to bring back the panel as well as Abu Kamra, whose face you will not see, but whose voice you will hear. So listen. The rules are like this. I don't allow swearing in the channel. If you swear, my mod squad will probably just put you on timeout, or if it's real bad, like if you're just at that level, they'll just kick you out. They have a level of discretion with that. But I tell them to allow a lot of leeway usually. Also, if you start getting to minor name calling, we can handle a little bit about that. But if you start getting to extreme name calling, you'll be warned as well. So there's a level of discretion, but I got a great mod squad. They know how to do this. And also threats and that type of thing. I encourage if some threats and that type of nonsense goes on, screenshot it and do all that, but then get rid of those folks because we don't really want any of that. So I'd like to have this live chat be better behaved than the audience at the debate we just watched, which was Trinity or Tawheed. Took place in Queens, New York. Many of you saw on the live stream. At one point, over 4,000 people were watching it on YouTube Live alone. So very high interest level, and we're going to talk about it now. We're going to discuss major points, major takeaways. We've all dealt with this. We all have knowledge of the subject in various ways. We've all discussed these things before as Christian apologists. I'm not going to introduce the panel too much other than tell you their names, and you can check out their stuff. Anthony Rogers, Jeff Cran, check him out at Zion's Banner, and then Abu Kamra. And so here we go. I'm bringing everybody on. Welcome to, man, I'm trying to put myself in the middle is what I'm trying to do here, guys. I want to be in the middle. Okay, I'm in the middle now. All right, I'm monkey in the middle. All right, so what's going on, fellas, as well as Abu Kamra? Let's make sure we can hear your voice, bro. Abu? Okay. So he'll be the disembodied voice that you will hear. Okay, so I'm looking here now, right now at the live chat already, and there's going to be a lot here. I've got it on slow mode every 60 seconds, but Renee, you might be expressing a lot of people's views as well. Oh, wait a minute. Look at this. Hey, when you said it was a circus, Renee says that was a circus, and I think so. Yeah, the moderator did say it would kick people out for shouting, but that didn't quite happen. So we're going to discuss that, but as well as some of the actual points raised. And there is my man John McCrae in the house. Hey, man, how you doing? It's real good to see you, bro. John McCrae is in the house, and it's a pleasure to see you. All right, so let's, Anthony, are you available right now? I'd like to get your thoughts first, just sort of your immediate general takeaway reaction. Please do share. We'll start with you, bro. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know that, Anthony. That's something people are unaware of about. Right. Nah. Yeah, that was a circus too. You know, David's.
And what would our assessment be of hijab's arguments, quite apart from what David said or didn't say, right? I mean, because there's always more that could be said. And in a debate, of course, you have time constraints and so forth and limitations. So
No doubt. Hey, John McCrae, thank you. I adjusted that audio. Appreciate that, bro. Thank you for real. And John, if you want to join, you know you got my Skype. It'd be great to have you. So, Jeff Cran, your immediate takeaways.
I just saw all this posturing, like the sing-songiness and the I don't know what to call it. I mean, for a while it looked like we were going to have like an invocation of some. I mean, it looked really kind of strange to me when I first tuned in. But there just seemed to be this posturing. There were like undertones of stuff along with the academic points. There were these like little jabs that I didn't feel had much to do with anything.
I mean, it began all the way really in the pre-debate discussion. So we did a program last night that was a preview of the debate. And one of the things that Irvin and I, a.k.a. Swerve from Operation Apologetics, pointed out is how Mohammed Hijab seemed to be taking his cues from MMA fighters and pro wrestling as far as the lead-up to the debate, calling David Wood boy 4 times within 15 seconds in one of these videos, and all this posturing and grandiose grandstanding, etc., giving David Wood 3 days, all this kind of thing. And so it is certainly true that behavior continued in the debate, which is a prediction that we had made. We had made that prediction on last night's program, which, already I think 1,200 or more people have watched that, and that program was just last night. And unfortunately, the prediction came true, although I must say I was surprised at the level that it was out in full force as far as that kind of behavior. I didn't think it was going to be that bad. Not only that, I didn't think the audience was going to be the way they were between the live chat and the audience. I don't want to say I've never seen anything like this because I deal with Hebrew Israelites a lot, and I know how they behave. But honestly, I have not seen anything quite like this on a bigger stage within Islamic Christian debates in a long time, especially in a Western context, unless it's at Speaker's Corner or something like that. But this was pretty wild. Now, Abu, I'm going to ask you next, but real quick, people asked me to summarize what Anthony said. Some of your audio wasn't heard in the beginning. What Anthony was saying is essentially that David has the ability to be sarcastic, but if you watch the debate, he didn't respond in kind the way that Mohammed Hijab was coming at him with the sarcasm and the mockery. He just plodded away with the points. And this is a very interesting debate where it'd be very interesting to see the transcript of it. If an objective person looks through and reads the transcript and simply just sees the points made and lined up point with counterpoint, where you don't have the emotive aspect and you don't have the rhetorical flourish and you don't have, quite frankly, the master sophistry of Mohammed Hijab, I don't see any way how anybody would score it as far as a W for Hijab. But the audience and the watching Muslim world, that's another story. Abu Kammer, initial thoughts and impressions on the Wood Hijab debate, which is called Trinity or Tawheed.
Well, very quickly, you mentioned the prediction about taking cues from MMA. It was interesting at the very, very end, the very last question, in which a Christian woman was rather rough with Mohammed Hijab. She had said, well, whatever the case, at some point he had said back to her, he said, "I smashed your boy," to quote Khabib, and meaning this the current lightweight champion in the UFC, if I'm not mistaken. So the cues from MMA became literal. Whatever the case.
Not only that, hey, real quick, I'm going to let you finish. I'm going to let you finish like Kanye. Remember, he also quoted The Rock?
Yes.
So this is clear. This is where this guy is getting his cues from. And it's funny because last night, when in our debate preview, my friend Irvin said, "Did he just give the people's eyebrow?" And I said, "What's the people's eyebrow?" And apparently that's The Rock's eyebrow thing that he does. So, I mean, true. But go ahead, bro. Go ahead. I want to just add to your point. Go ahead.
No, understood. And I honestly don't know much about Mohammed Hijab. I know he's a gentleman from Speaker's Corner, and I know Speaker's Corner can get a bit rough. From what I had heard going in, I mean, this is going to sound a little off, but I expected worse. I think he came off more professional than I expected to some degree. But yes, I agree. There was a lot of bravado and a lot of rough talk, and he would openly admit that. He did openly admit it when others brought it up. Whatever the case, one thing, getting back to the substance of the debate, it seemed Mohammed Hijab sort of successfully made it about the Trinity almost in a vacuum. I feel like maybe we need to go through a transcript or something, but I feel like there was very little discussion on Tawheed and what those terms means. I appreciated that David very briefly in the Q&A brought up the fact that the semantic range of Tawheed can include unification and consolidation and stuff like that.
Which is a point you made in a video you released today as well.
Yeah. It's a subject of interest to me, that the word Tawheed, the way Orthodox Muslims use it, they artificially limit it, but I don't know.
Yeah, so
let me make
hold on, just a second, Anthony. We're gonna get there. But I wanted to get initial impressions. Let me read a couple audience things. Brother TC says it got totally meta when Hijab pulled a 2QK about mockery at the end. And so this is in relationship to the woman's question that you just mentioned, Abu. When he said, well, the reason I'm being this way with David, because he was saying, you're right, I'm not treating him with respect at all and it's justified. It's because of how he mocks Muslims, which is not true. David doesn't mock Muslims, but he does mock Islamic teaching from Muhammad. And the funny thing is, in the beginning of the debate, remember Mohammed Hijab said, David's going to employ that fallacy. Then, of course, what does Mohammed Hijab do when he's confronted with the fact that his behavior consists of something that he's chastising people about? He pulls the tukuko. I always mispronounce it, Abu.
I don't know. I say tukokwe, but I can
go. Okay. He pulled it. So good point, Brother TC. But go ahead, Anthony. Go ahead, bro.
Well, what I was going to say, you were right in thinking I was about to get into something substantive concerning what was said in the debate. So I can forestall that for now.
Well, okay.
It was about Tawheed, and something I found interesting is how he quoted and the audience repeated Surah 112, which is actually grammatically mistaken in the Quran, and leads to that sort of question that David asked. You'll notice the crowd said they completed the first line of Surah 112, Surah Al-Ikhlas, and said ahad, but it actually says ahadun in the Arabic text. I don't know if Denny wants to chime in on that. I don't know if he's noticed that.
Are you saying that the audience's misunderstanding came out in mass when they repeated in unison? Hey, Anthony, you're going out of screen. You only have a little.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, there you go.
Somebody text. I was sorry.
Anthony, do you want to call us back when you're better prepared? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, just kidding, bro. Okay, so this seemed like, and Jeff, you'd mentioned this in the beginning. Didn't this seem like a religious exercise more than a proper academic debate? What I mean is, it begins with Quranic recitation, right? I didn't hear any passages being read from the Bible, but that's how it began, with clearly what is a religious exercise. Okay. And then during the debate, you have similar activity. You even have crowd and response. Don't forget, Mohammed Hijab not only showed a total disregard for the rules by doing things such as interrupting David in the middle of his cross-examination questions, mocking, snickering into the microphone loudly while David is actually speaking. Not only did he do that, as the debater, the audience showed total disregard for the rules as well. Remember, in the beginning, it was said that clapping is sufficient. The audience apparently didn't think so. It appears that rules are mere suggestions to the men and women in the crowd. And it wasn't just a few. It was clear that there was a large part of the crowd that was behaving this way. The moderator himself seemed frustrated, saying, Muslims don't behave this way. Well, are you saying that people in the audience are Muslims? I don't think he was saying that. Now, I appreciate the man's perspective. He seemed more open-minded. But that was interesting. But Jeff, more on your perception about that, because I don't. This is probably your first time seeing one of these things live, I think.
This particular venue.
Yeah.
But comparing it with like Shmuley Boteach and Dr. Michael Brown, like a Jewish Christian dialogue, messianic, non-messianic, you would never open with Shmuley being there with a Christian prayer and 14 minutes of New Testament reading, and then we're going to get into the debate about Jesus's messiahship. You wouldn't do that. And so with that chanting and stuff, it was almost like you're not being equally respectful. Can David Wood offer a Christian invocation in the name of the Son of God? I mean, you're not. You've got it tilted. You've got the expression tilted here.
Abu, general thoughts on sort of the maybe behavior and some of that. You're generally guarded and cautious, but I'm still be curious what you thought of all of that stuff happening.
Well, I mean, I think Mohammed Hijab himself would agree that he was rude. He felt he had a good reason for it. It was a response. I mean, the truth of the matter is that David Wood is he represents something in particular in the minds of many Muslims who are into Muslim-Christian debate. He's sort of like a point of rage for them. And so, I mean, I think it's almost a blinding rage for certain people. And that's not to say that Mohammed Hijab had reached that point, but I think he channeled a little bit of that, and the crowd was much more whipped up in that regard. They were much more angry at their perception of David Wood.
He clearly tapped into that angst and animosity, and he clearly played the role of sort of riot provocateur, poisoning the well at various points, bringing up all kinds of irrelevant things, and it's it's a real shame, but again, this was the same behavior before the debate, so it's not like Mohammed Hijab went through any kind of transformation. All he's doing is taking this kind of behavior that he's exhibited at Speaker's Corner, and let me bring this up. He said that, but Jay Smith is a pacifist, and yet he's been out on Speaker Corner for years. He's been pushed off the ladder. He's been punched. He's been attacked a lot, and as a pacifist, in the love of Christ, he gets back up on the ladder and just continues speaking while bleeding sometimes. This is a relatively regular occurrence that he's attacked this way, that he's been attacked this way, even as an older man. Mohammed Hijab, when he went out Speaker's Corner while Jay Smith was speaking, and we played the clips from this last night, so watch the video of what I'm talking about, imitated and mocked Jay Smith. And was actually imitating his hand movements. Jay Smith went like that. Mohammed Hijab would go like that. And then he's flexing his muscles and all this kind of stuff. I'm not even joking. He literally acted like Halal Hogan with Jay Smith on Speaker's Corner. So my point by saying that is this. Mohammed Hijab used the excuse of David Wood, his collection of videos. But he did the same thing to Jay Smith. And Jay Smith is certainly no David Wood. So this is Hijab's M.O. Everybody should be aware of that, and I think those who have debated him in the past are. Now, let's transition. Anthony, you wanted to start getting right into the doctrine and theology. You mentioned a little bit about it. Is there something else, though, because I want to let you start there. And now, guys, here's what we're going to do. So we're kind of transitioning. We may talk about the behavior again, but honestly, this whole live stream could be about the behavior of the folks there if we wanted to go that right. I mean, you actually had chance of Takbir, Allahu Akbar. It was at a point where the audience started clapping at every single question Mohammed Hijab offered. Then, if you guys noticed towards the end of the debate, the audience was so pumped up, they were cheering and clapping for every time a Muslim at all from the crowd asked a question of David Wood. That's how amped up it was. Now, we could talk about that the whole time. We're not going to do that. But we are going to get now into some of the doctrinal and theological issues. Anthony, kick us off, okay? Kick us off, my man. Oh, you're muted again, my man. You're muted. Unmute yourself there. I know. Go ahead, bro.
One of the first things that needs to be mentioned that stood out to me, and I think needs to be highlighted, especially since this is a recurring problem in all Christian-Muslim dialogue, and that is what it means to be a monotheist. When Hijab started the debate, he said that Tawheed is monotheism. That is, the two are simply equated, right? Tawheed is monotheism, monotheism is Tawheed. The truth of the matter is that Tawheed is a version of monotheism, right? Tawheed is a way of saying that you believe in one God. But if we're defining the doctrine of the Trinity biblically, classically, and so forth, it's also a form of monotheism. There's simply no orthodox, creedal, confessional statement of the doctrine of the Trinity that ever amounts to an affirmation of belief in a plurality of gods. And so it's simply fallacious to simply conflate those two things and pretend that the doctrine of the Trinity can be defined out of
you're
mono or simply refuted.
Breaking up a little.
Sorry about that.
Can change any parameters, but go ahead.
Now I thought it was interesting because he also started the debate by mentioning a number of logical fallacies, and yet right at the get-go he committed a fallacy by straw-manning the what monotheism means, and also by straw-manning what the doctrine of the Trinity is. Remember when he said he was referring to the doctrine as taught in the Athanasian Creed, and I wrote this down, he says it's one being divided into three persons. But of course, that's not how the Athanasian Creed defines the doctrine of the Trinity. That's not how any Christian defines the doctrine of the Trinity. And so he straw-manned the Christian position from the get-go. And you also hear him doing this at a number of junctures in the debate where he almost tries to catch himself a number of times, but repeatedly he refers to the doctrine of the Trinity as belief in three gods, which I find ironic, and this will be my last point, and I'll let somebody else speak, which I found ironic in light of his claim that the Qur'an does not misdefine the doctrine of the Trinity. If the Qur'an doesn't misdefine the doctrine of the Trinity, why does he constantly slip back into referring to it as belief in three gods when No Christian defines it that way. There's something else operating on his thinking here that leads him to so effortlessly slide into misdefining it as polytheism.
Yeah, and a lot of interesting comments here in the live chat. Can't get to them all, but let me say a few things to the folks in the audience who like this content, this type of post-debate review analysis, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum. Please give this a thumbs up, and also be sure to put some insightful comments in there. I saw somebody who was using foul language, and so Maz, I don't know if you saw that person, but get them out of here. It was clear they were anti-Islamic. I'm not going to say they're Christian because I don't think the way they were speaking they would be Christian, but remove them. And then we're going to also ask you guys to still grab this link and share it, because to my knowledge we are the first and immediate people to give analysis to this. So switching over to Jeff and then Abu, what are some immediate theological points you wanted to get into? I think Anthony's main point there, which is well-founded indeed, is that Mohammed Hijab repeatedly misrepresented Christian history, church history, as well as what the councils and creeds did or didn't do, what they said or didn't say, and as well as the very doctrine of the Trinity itself, which is the topic of debate. And I want to remind everybody, and I'm getting over to you, Jeff, on your theological points, or at least one of them. Let's kind of go one at a time here.
Yep.
Did you hear, audience, I'm talking to you, Muslims, I'm talking to you, did you hear a clear defense for Tawheed? Did you hear Tawheed clearly defined? Did you ever hear this during the debate? Mohammed Hijab never laid a clear case down for the Islamic understanding. He barely responded to most of David's critiques. This is not a good debate. And notice we're not here voting who won. We're not operating that way. We're saying the behavior by Hijab was shameful, utterly shameful. You could say shameless because he seemed to show no shame. And we're also saying that this employed sophistry and rhetorical tricks, not really getting at the issues. And a big critique, I would say, is he never really presented the main object of his case. Jeff Coran, what are some comments you want to make here?
He sort of did what was interesting to me, and one of the reasons I really wanted to get on is he played what I call the Jew card. The Jews never.
The Muslim played the Jew card?
Yeah, the Muslim played the Jew card. The Jews never accepted this. The Jews never let plurality in. And then claiming that David Wood didn't know Hebrew, he committed a number of Hebrew errors as far as grammar.
Okay, can you go there right now? Go there.
Let's go there right now.
So now, everyone, hold on. I love to review things for everybody. So the Jew just said the Muslim played the Jew card, right? And now what he's saying is that the guy who tried to say, again, what kind of behavior is this? Do not talk to me about Arabic on this stage. You will not talk to me about Arabic. What is that? Doing that made a bunch of errors in regards to the Hebrew. Okay, so go ahead, my man.
Okay, first of all, he made the ridiculous claim that the singular male pronoun is the only pronoun associated with Elohim, when pronouns are attached to Hebrew nouns as suffixes often, and when it says, let us make God in our image, there's a pronoun our attached to the word salam, image, which is a plural first-person pronoun, not singular.
Despite what he said, so clearly showing...
Despite what he said.
Clearly showing while he's lecturing David, who didn't make any mistakes in Arabic, it's just he's saying you don't know Arabic, basically. And remember, David is quoting Islamic sources for his Arabic translations, right? So Mohammed Hijab is ultimately fighting with other faithful Muslims who are scholars in this area, unlike Mohammed Hijab. And now you're pointing out the man who chided him about the language. What did he do? Make a bunch of mistakes about the Hebraic language.
Yeah.
Did you have another one you wanted to share or reiterate?
Well, yeah. The verb subject agreement in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You don't say we is not amused. Okay?
Right.
Your verb has to match. Well, when the word make is used with Elohim, it's plural in the Hebrew, not singular. So that's why you have let us make, but the make is plural too. So our image is got a plural pronoun. The verb referring back to Elohim is plural. And under verb subject agreement, it would have to be singular if there was no mystery of plurality there.
Right. Fact v Fiction says he also said that bara was a pronoun, LOL, when it's a verb. I don't remember. I didn't catch him saying that. Did anyone catch him say that bara was a pronoun when it's a verb? I can't. Can you confirm or deny?
I didn't hear him say pronoun.
Okay.
I didn't hear him say pronoun.
Now, it's a little tricky because, Abu, I can't see your face, so I don't want to leave you out. But see, when I see Anthony shake his head, I know, hey, Anthony, da-da-da. So I do want to pass it over to you. But, Anthony, first, it seems like you had some comments perhaps on the language you wanted to make or reiterate, because I want our audience to understand that Mohammed Hijab made basic mistakes in the Hebrew, all the while chastising David for the language.
Yeah, so this will just underscore Jeffrey's point. But Mohammed Hijab made the claim that in Hebrew, he quoted the first three words of Genesis, Bereshit bara Elohim, and he made the correct observation that while Elohim is a plural noun, bara is a singular verb. It refers to the fact that there's one God. That's not a problem for Christians, because, of course, Christians only believe in one God. However, it's not the case, as Jeffrey already pointed out, that you only have singular terms used in connection with Elohim. For example, in Genesis 20:13, speaking of God, Abraham said, this is now in reference to Elohim, they caused me to wander from my father's house. Now, this is in Hebrew, not in the English text. In Genesis 35:7, it says, Jacob said of God, they revealed themselves there. In Deuteronomy 4:7, Moses says of the Lord, in contrast to the pagan gods of the nations, that whenever Israel calls out to him, they, that is the Lord, draw nigh. Over and over again, you see this phenomena in the Hebrew text. And so it's not only false for Mohammed Hijab to say you don't find this sort of thing, it's also ironic that he would be chiding David for presuming to speak on a language he doesn't know, when he would be doing that very thing and making colossal mistakes.
Yeah, great point. Omer, despite what you just said, Mohammed Hijab made no mistakes about the Hebrew. So let's reiterate again. What are the mistakes that Mohammed Hijab, can you say the short version? Because
the short version, there are plural pronouns associated with Elohim and with the other names of God.
And yet he said that there weren't.
He said there weren't.
Okay, so that's the main one. And then Fact v Fiction mentioned another one we didn't catch. Fact v Fiction, we weren't saying it didn't happen. We were just saying we didn't catch that. So thank you for that. Now, Abu, what about the Arabic? Arab Not Muslim says Wood did make mistakes in Arabic. And okay, hey, just let us know your thoughts. Did you catch anything about the Arabic, Abu, between either man that you would want to comment as far as the language? I know we're talking about the theology, but kind of transitioned into the language aspect. Abu, do you have something you could give us on that, if off the top of your head? Again, we are not watching the video. We literally just saw this, and so we're trying to immediately do it and give a reasoned reaction and theological commentary to it. But Abu, what about
on the Arabic? I mean, on the Arabic, there's not much that I remember. Although I will say that on the question of God praying, I think that Mohammed Hijab was making a point that maybe he made it too fast, even though he attempted to make it several times, which was that about Salah, that he was trying to make a point about the preposition that follows it. Salah, Allah, so on, upon, or to was the point he was trying to make. I think it was a decent point, but he made it so fast, I think David missed it and may not have understood what he was saying. That's the only thing I recall about the Arabic. Although the other thing that I would say actually was in response to when the discussion of Tawheed briefly came up, and as Anthony referred to, Mohammed Hijab referred to the opening verse of Surah Al-Ikhlas, and he said that he got the audience to continuously repeat the word ahad. And the point that I would make is that the way that word appears, the way the word ahad appears just about in every other place in the Qur'an, it's not obviously something that's indivisible, and you can even use it to refer to something that comprises multiple persons, such as a tribe. I can't think of a Quranic verse that does that, but the point is that him claiming that the word ahad is necessarily referring to something indivisible, that's a very popular claim. I don't agree.
Right, excellent. Omer, I'm not going to let you talk about my Jewish Christian friend Jeff that way, so you are on timeout. Come back without the invective, and maybe you can stay. Mod Squad, watch Omer because you can see the comment that I just deleted as well as what he's saying there. So we've kicked out one person denigrating Islam. Now we've put someone on timeout saying unkind stuff about my friend Jeff. All right, so I'm looking at a lot of comments here from the Muslims here. And by the way, I'm glad you came. I'm glad you're here. We don't say that mocking. Notice the level that we're speaking about this. It's not mocking, it's not laughing, it's not cackling. We're pointing out linguistic errors right now. Prior to that, we pointed out some theological mistakes. Notice the level there that we're going. What I'm seeing, unfortunately, by a lot of the Muslim commenters right now are a lot of excuses for Mohammed Hijab's debate behavior. Again, I'm not trying to come back to this, but that's what I see you guys doing. Why are you defending this? Why are you guys defending this behavior? And some of you are minimizing it, saying, oh, he was just excited. No, these were calculated things that he had said and done. And a lot of it is just what's called grandstanding. Now, in certain cultures, this is considered appealing or compelling behavior. For example, you should have brought James White with you. You should have brought some help with you. And I remember at the end of towards the beginning, I'm done with this man. I'm done. All this kind of thing, and I'm just naming a few at the top of my head. And that's sort of mild. It clearly got worse as it went on. Listen, if you call yourself a Muslim, don't excuse this kind of behavior. Don't act like it's okay. Don't make excuses for it. Don't think it's justified. This is not a good look. I really hope you understand, and you should know that, because does someone have the source about you're not supposed to mock others' religions? Does anyone have that source on them? Abu, Anthony, do you know what I'm referring to at least? I can look this up. Does anyone know the context of that quote? Anthony or Abu, do you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can find it real quick while you guys continue the conversation.
Abu, are you familiar with what I'm talking about? Where are you there, bro?
I don't have the eye offhand, but although interestingly enough, Mohammed Hijab himself brought it up. So I mean, you know.
Oh, he did.
About not mocking what people worship, and of course, there's a few verses like that. I think even in Surah Al-Furqan, there's a thing about how when the people of the Jahiliyyah respond with insults. The believers
hold on, Anthony. Hold on. Let him finish, Anthony, please. Go ahead.
With salams and stuff like that. So, I mean, I don't know. Go ahead. Let Anthony get one about not.
You're bringing up the point that Mohammed Hijab himself brought up, the fact that you're not supposed to do that, and yet here you go. And again, like quoting the MMA fighter, it's just now someone in the channel said, "Oh, Mohammed Hijab has ruined his academic debate career." I got to be honest. I wish that was true, but I think because of a lot of the way that certain people process these types of events, I think he did exactly what a large part of his base actually wanted him to do, and I think this is actually going to elevate him in the eyes of sort of the fanboy folks in the world of Islamic apologetics and what they call dawah. Now, I wish that wasn't true. I wish I could agree that this is going to be damaging to his sort of debate career. I think actually the opposite is true. He's probably skyrocketed now into this sort of upper echelon in a lot of Muslim folks' eyes, and I bet you a lot of these dawah organizations are going to be emailing him tomorrow and tonight because of this debate behavior. I wish
it raises an interesting question, because he had implied that he'd be more cordial in a debate with someone like James White. I have to wonder, would Dr. White find his behavior unbecoming enough to have a debate with him, or if Dr. White would actually want to have a debate with him precisely to test that, to see if having a more cordial demeanor in general produces a better result. I mean, it is an interesting question. Excellent. I have to admit, even myself, I would be curious to see how that would turn out, but who knows? Excellent.
Anthony Rogers, if you could do it. Marshall Mathers, which is... Are you a Muslim? Because if your name is Marshall Mathers, that's haram, right? You're Marshall Mathers, if everyone knows who Marshall Mathers is. I know the one you're referring to. Allah says you have your own religion, we have ours. That's actually not what I'm referring to, although I appreciate it. But you should probably change your name if you're Muslim, because calling yourself Marshall Mathers seems like it'd be haram. But go ahead, Anthony. What's the source on that, please?
Yeah, well, there's actually two verses here. One I think is the one we're thinking of, but it's not, I think, specifically relevant. It's Surah 6:108, where it says, "Don't insult those they invoke other than Allah, lest they insult Allah in enmity without knowledge." I don't think hijab insulted, per se, Christian doctrines. I might be overlooking something, but I do think he was insulting and necessarily antagonizing David. So the verse in the Quran that I think is relevant to that is found in Surah 16:125, where it says, "Invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction, and argue with them in a way that is best. Indeed, your Lord is most knowing of who is strayed from his way." And so the Quran does enjoin upon Muslims to speak with graciousness and so forth toward people. At the same time, as most people know, the Quran doesn't speak consistently, and there are any number of ways one might want to go about explaining that inconsistency. Muslims, of course, would have theirs. I would say that it's accounted for by virtue of the changing situation of Muhammad moving from a position of minority in Mecca to having some power and authority in Medina.
Anthony Rogers, who are the worst of all creatures?
Jews and Christians.
Right. Who's going to become pigs when Allah comes back?
Well, Jews and Christians.
Right. Yeah, guys,
well,
these are Islamic sources here.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, though, there are Islamic sources that also would say that Muslims who play music and so forth are going to be transfigured in that way.
That's why I mentioned the Marshall Mathers guy, because that's Eminem's real name, and it seems like he's a Muslim calling himself Marshall Mathers. Apparently, we not only have Eminem in the live chat, we have Osama bin Laden. Now, I hope this is sort of some person who's like a troll in imitating a Muslim, because we've got Osama bin Laden from the grave. Your man got smashed, Allahu Akbar. I'm hoping that that's a troll, but it doesn't seem like it, because here's a guy without sort of the wild name. Abu, let's get into a point. I want you to address the theological point. Here's why. Because here's a Muslim in the live chat, DNF BDB, who says, in all caps, by the way, "You fools can't even address the points that were made in the debate. You fools." Taking his inspiration there from, it looks like Cobra Commander. Let's address some of the points made in the debate. Abu, speak to something either incorrect let's do that. Abu, you had a couple
maybe
of
the Tertullian thing, if that's okay. Because if I'm not mistaken, that was his first question.
Let's go.
I could be wrong, but of his 4 questions, he wanted to focus on the whole thing about. Well, I don't know if it was directly in his 4 questions, but he certainly talked about Tertullian being a subordinationist, and I'm pretty sure I know what text he had in mind, because if you go to what is it? It's the against Praxeas, right? Adversus Praxean, which is Tertullian's work.
Yeah.
So, for example, you can find this in Roberts and Donaldson's Ante-Nicene Christian Library. That's usually the verse the version, the translation that gets quoted a lot. But anyway,
so let me real quick. Let me give the audience a little bit of background. So, Mohammed Hijab mentioned Tertullian. Who is Tertullian? He's a North African early church Christian writer, I believe, from Carthage. He was a lawyer and then became a Christian apologist and polemicist. He's sort of active circa 185 AD, and he wrote in Latin and did say in Latin in 212 AD this word Trinitas. He used that in relationship to the Trinity. And Mohammed Hijab had brought up Tertullian, accusing him of essentially a sort of a Trinitarian error, perhaps maybe a Trinitarian heresy, but we'll just say something that's heterodox, of sort of a hard subordinationism. I think that's what you're going to get into. Could you explain that? I'm just giving people background. Go ahead, Abu. The floor is yours again.
So I forget if he quoted it or not, but I'm pretty sure that he either alluded to or quoted directly from the 9th chapter of Tertullian's Adversus Praxean, where Tertullian says things like the Father is the entire substance, but the Son is a derivation and portion of the whole. Or he also says that Christ's inferiority is described as being a little lower than the angels. This is Tertullian in the 9th chapter of Adversus Praxean. And when you see this, it does seem to it seems the case is clear when you sort of experience that veritable soundbite in a vacuum. However, if you jump to like the 22nd chapter of Tertullian, he begins to say things like when Christ says, "I and my Father are one," he shows that there are two whom have an equality united in one substance and stuff like that. And so what I would propose, and it's interesting because Mohammed Hijab said that at some point he said, David, I don't think you ever read Tertullian. I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I do question whether Mohammed Hijab has actually read the writings of Tertullian or whether he was just given an excerpt, which in a vacuum seems subordinationist. What I would propose is, first, that Tertullian is difficult to read, but second, the fact that Tertullian in one place is quoting verses, quoting the Psalms and saying that Christ is a little bit lower than the angels as inferior to the Father, yet in another place is declaring Christ equal to the Father, which is he's in a sense echoing the Bible itself in that regard. John 5:18 has Christ being equal with the Father. But what I would propose is that I think that Tertullian, even though obviously he lived centuries before the Council of Chalcedon, he's giving a sort of proto-Diophysite picture. He's painting it vaguely, that within one respect Christ is inferior to the Father, yet in another respect Christ is equal to the Father. And I know our Muslim friends will say that's a contradiction. How does that make sense? But it sort of falls into the whole thing with the incarnation. It comes up in the second chapter of Philippians, this idea that Christ, who has equality with God, at the same time takes on the role of a servant. I've seen a number of people, they like to say an equality of nature, but since the incarnation, an inequality of rank from the perspective of his humanity.
Excellent.
That's the way I would put it. And I think Tertullian vaguely alludes to it when you read him in his entirety. He's a proto-Diophysite. That's the way I'd put it. Sorry.
Excellent. So there we're addressing one point. By the way, that's a historical point, and it's not even really salient to the question of Trinity or Tawheed, right? Because what Tertullian's position specifically within a Trinitarian understanding is not actually relevant to which one is true, Trinity or Tawheed. But yet, Mohammed Hijab made so many errors when he would discuss things like this that we're correcting him. We've already corrected him linguistically in regards to the Hebrew. We've already corrected his actual behavior. And now we're correcting a question in relation to the history of Christian thought. Jeff, to the Muslims who say that we're not doing any correction of debate points, you had texted me a number of things and tweeted a number of things in regards to that during the debate. Could you bring up one of those now, and so we can show that there's a lot to correct there?
David started to allude to it, but I wanted him to, I wanted to do more with it. It was like this idea that the Judaism of the Second Temple period allowed for no mystery or plurality in the Godhead is absolutely absurd. And, there are even Jewish scholars like David Boyarin in the Jewish Gospels that points out what was called the doctrine of two powers that began to discuss. And so he's painting the Jews as agreeing with Tawheed in all of its implications. And that's not historically correct to the writings at the time, like the Targums, which, by the way, would have been read in the synagogues in Jesus' day. So things like the Memra would have been available material. I'm not saying the original Hebrew text wasn't read, but the Targums were accessible. And so this picture that, again, he set up a straw man. Where do you see the language of the Nicene Creed in the Old Testament? And it was like, that was a ridiculous straw man to set up, as if Hellenistic Greek language from 300 AD was going to be found in the intertestamental period of Judaism.
Yeah, not only that, but I mean, the point about the Trinity, and David brought this up in the debate. He said Muslims and Christians agree with progressive revelation. And the point is that further aspects of God's nature and character, which are revealed slowly over time, even in the Old Testament, right, don't come into a full or orbed view until the incarnation, which makes sense because that is a special, unique event wherein the second person of the Trinity comes and dwells amongst us. John 1:14. And so it makes sense that you would have explication and talk doctrinally about that after the incarnation. not really prior. Now, the point Jeff partially made there, I believe, and I hope everyone caught it, it had to do with the Aramaic phrase memra and whatnot. He's saying that Second Temple Judaism, which is the period in which Jesus would have lived in general, we can even say first century Judaism, first of all is what's called variegated, meaning there's different perspectives within it. And you can even see that sort of on a simple level with Josephus when he mentions 4 different schools of Judaistic thought during his day: the Essenes and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? The Zealots, right? And you can even see that different party factions in the Gospels themselves. Okay, so taking that all into play, it's clear that there's plenty of understandings of the nature of who God is, even within that framework, that are not incompatible with a multi-personal or complex understanding of unity. And so that's the point. But see, this isn't really what Mohammed Hijab was trying to understand or have heard. This wasn't a point of education. This was another point. And here's a great example of it. Listen to this screen handle. Make America Islam Again says that answer the question at Vocab Malone. If Hijab mocked Christians for 20 years, you would love that David mocked Muslims for ages, and you don't care. Now, it's a little confusing there, but I think what he's saying is that, hey, if you guys had somebody who was mocking Islam for that long, you would want them to do the same thing. And you just don't understand the ethics of our religion versus yours. That's not true. No, that is not how Christians are to respond or react. So it's incorrect. But again, I would love for you to clarify your name, Make America Islam Again. That reminds me, and let me break off here a little bit. I'm sorry, but this is
American Fit.
What'd you say, Abu?
I'm sorry. I was mildly joking. I said American Fitra. I was just joking. I was
right. Yeah.
Its nascent stage was must have been.
By the way, there's
but continue what you're saying. I'm hoping we can get back to the thing with Memra in Targum Onkelos or something.
Well,
when
we had discussed this a few other times in a few other contexts. I don't want to get too deep into that, although I appreciate the point because I think it's been made. By the way, shout out to RWK for the super chat. Someone had also gave earlier. I forget who it was. I'm sorry for that. But shout out to you, RWK. But actually, the Make America Islam Again actually I think gets us to something very important. And Abu, I do want you to comment on this if you could. Okay, check this out. Did you catch when Mohammed Hijab brought up the military conquests and victories of Muhammad and says, by the way, which is something we are not ashamed of.
Not ashamed of, yeah, I caught that. Yeah.
And he said, this shows our guy was a winner. And this is interesting, too, because he said that, and anyone who knows a little bit about the aggressive military exploits of Muhammad as a general, raiding caravans who were not threatening him, for example, with peoples who he was not even at war with. Like this is the behavior of Muhammad. But if you go further, as you look at Islamic imperialism throughout the ages, it's very, very interesting. I don't think there's been a more imperialistic religion ever. But yet, does anyone remember when Mohammed Hijab went way off, railing against the evils of European colonialism, and brought up everything under the sun that he could, which, by the way, is clearly irrelevant to the topic at hand. But can you speak a little bit about that mentality? Because I think Make America Islam Again may share some of those sentiments about being proud about the aggressive nature of Muhammad himself in a military context. But could you share your thoughts? Because you caught that. What did you think when you heard it?
Well, first off, when he mentioned colonialism, to be fair to him, it was in response to an audience question saying Islam was spread by the sword. So actually, the audience question said Islam was spread by the sword while Christianity was not.
Doesn't he commit there the U2 fallacy that he accused David Wood of committing earlier? Remember that?
Perhaps. But I think his point was that.
Well, of course he does.
That Christianity, that claim that Christianity was not spread by the sword is to some degree false. So he brought up everything from Theodosius to British and French and Spanish colonialism, where there was a level of coercion afoot. But what I would say about him saying our guy is a winner, to be honest, I have no idea how he himself understands that, unfortunately. And I think that is a relevant point, because it is possible that while, of course, those of us who are a bit more critical might say, here are sources which depict Muhammad as engaging in warfare that was not justified. He may not agree. He may not even be aware of those sources, or he may interpret them differently, and he may just be under the impression that such warfare only happened under justified causes. Of course, another possibility, at least, I'm not saying he holds to this idea, but there are Salafis who believe that merely having wrong beliefs justifies, warfare and aggression and stuff like that. I don't know if that's where he's at.
It's funny.
I don't know. It's a subject that I don't get into much, the whole thing with violence, because I think it's a very deep and difficult and nuanced subject.
When you have a guy saying, I'm proud of military conquest, we're going to comment on that. And that's what he was doing. I'm proud. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm glad about it. It shows our guy wins. And do not the sources say that Allah has made me victorious through terror? Anthony Rogers, are you familiar with what I'm referring to? He's made me victorious through terror.
Yeah. He says that in his dream that the keys of the kingdoms of the world were given to him, and he was promised that he'd be made victorious through terror.
What's the source for that? Do you know off your head, or could you grab that?
Yeah.
So if you could throw that in the chat. Go ahead, Jeff, why Anthony finds that, because I think, unfortunately his attitude seems consistent there with Muhammad, made victorious through terror. By the way, everyone, while Jeff is speaking, be sure to look at the comment I've placed on the screen by our friend Make America Islam Again, because he explains some of his rationale. Go ahead, Jeff.
Here's the thing, because this does come up in circles with me too. Shmuley will bring up the Spanish Inquisition and things of this nature. The key is that as he's looking up that verse, you're going to see that Muhammad wasn't necessarily opposed to being a winner through those means. But I would say when you look at Jesus' teachings, can you find that the way Jesus stated he was going to win?
And
I think that's the key.
That's the real question. That's the real question right there. And again, none of this is necessarily bearing or relevant on the question of Trinity, the Tawheed. So while Anthony gets that up, I want to go ahead.
I posted it in our chat here on Skype because I don't have the browser open to the YouTube page. So if you could put that in there, I just put it in the comment section.
All right, I'm looking for it now.
Sahih Bukhari.
It's Sahih Bukhari, Volume 4, 52, 220.
Sahih Bukhari, Volume 4, 52, 20.
220.
220. Hold on. You know what? Let me just put that in here because I can't I'm not able to access it. Sahih
Bukhari, 4.52.
I'll put it in the chat. I can put it in the chat, I think.
Because I like to source this out, and so we are sourcing this out right here for everybody to see what we are talking about. Okay, so now as we look, it looks like RWK I think put it up as well. Thank you, appreciate that. Thank you very, very, very much. Okay, so back to some of the doctrinal points. Now, Jeff, you had made a couple other points in relation to specifically Trinity Tawheed, because again, remember everybody, the topic of this debate was supposed to be Trinity, the Christian conception of God based upon the scriptures, or Tawheed, which is supposed to be the Islamic conception of God based upon their sources. That was supposed to be what the debate was about. And Jeff, you had made a couple other points about some misunderstandings and things that needed clarification in regards to Mohammed Hijab's incorrect statements, specifically about the Trinity. Could you share some more of those or other things that you noticed in regards to that? Because I'm trying to have us focus more so than him on the topic of the debate.
I love that he pulled out the Shema, which he pronounced improperly. I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there since we're talking.
Right, it wouldn't be such a big deal if he wasn't talking down to David about Arabic, but the hypocrisy is on full display. Go ahead.
But here's the thing that really cracked me up. Yes, echad can be used of one, but there's a specific Hebrew word for one and one only or only, which is yechid. Take thy son, thy only son, yechid ben. So if I want to say only, as in uniquely one or only one, I could use the yechid. Now here's the important historical point that ties into the theology. God is not called Yechid formally in Judaism until Moses Maimonides' 13 articles, and Moses Maimonides was the physician to Saladin's vizier. So he was influenced by Islam, possibly. Possibly. That's just like a sketchy. I'm not saying, because I could get Orthodox Jews coming at me like I'm bashing on Maimonides here, the Rambam. But the key is, you don't see Yechid used formally in Judaism. It's always Echad, until the 13 articles. And it's Moses Maimonides that changes it in his article and uses Yechid.
Because he wanted to specifically eliminate a Christian possibility of the understanding
That's
of God.
right. It's polemic.
What it went before. Now, I am going to get to you, Boo, and Anthony, but people keep on bringing this up, so I don't know how I can ignore it. Proud Somali Muslim says, the reason why the Prophet allowed Muslim conquest was to happen because there was no such thing as the UN. Anyone could conquer your land, so it's good to conquer and spread your influence. We have apologists for Islamic imperialism in the live chat. Like, this is a acceptable, okay thing. So I know, Abu, you may not want to comment on that, but do you guys understand the mindset? See, we're just thinking, let's have an academic debate. We can talk respectfully to each other. But there's a larger thing here at play in the minds of some Salafi Muslims. And you can see it clearly here. And that's why the rules don't matter to some of these folks. That's why the grandstanding and saving face or trying to cast shame and aspersion. That's why, if you notice, it's all psychological warfare. Why did he keep on saying, you should be embarrassed, you should be ashamed? That's literally what he's trying to create. It's almost like speech act theory. He's trying to create that state of embarrassment. In the minds of the Muslims, they're like, oh, have you ever heard a debater before, since you were maybe a child, say, look at his face, everyone. Look at his face, ladies and gentlemen. Look at his face right now. What? And you come back, and here you see proud Somali Muslims saying, it's good to conquer other people's lands, to spread your influence. Well, duh. By the way, proud Somali Muslim, I'm not really sure what good the UN would do to stop anything like that then or now. So that's kind of a funny, irrelevant point, but someone's got to comment on that. Anthony, Jeff, you got to comment on
Oh, I've got to. Well, okay, so if we use the same reasoning, he's just justified the Crusades and the Inquisition.
Right.
I mean, you don't like it when the shoe's on the other foot.
Or the sandal.
Or the other sandal. I mean, the reality is you don't want to play by those rules when you're the minority. Do you really?
Yeah, and again, the point here is that Jesus did not teach that, yet Muhammad did. Anthony, comment on any of that, and then I'm going to switch over to Abu. Go ahead.
Actually, I want to go back to the debate topic on Tawheed and Trinity and the discussion of the Shema, if we have a chance for that.
Okay.
What I think a lot of people miss, but it's absolutely critical. Abu, or not, I keep saying Abu. Sorry, Abu. Mohammed Hijab pointed to the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, and to the fact that Jesus quotes it in the New Testament. Right? This is perhaps argument numero uno when it comes to Muslims appealing to the Bible in order to try and justify Islam or the Islamic version of Tawheed. But what's interesting when you see Jesus citing that passage in the New Testament is to look at the whole discussion, especially as it occurs in Matthew 22. In Matthew 22, you have various Jewish groups coming to Jesus and challenging him and trying to expose him in one way or another. You have the Sadducees, you have the Herodians, and then finally you have the Pharisees. And basically what's happening is Jesus refutes each one of them in turn. Right? He refutes the Pharisees, he refutes the Herodians, and now the Pharisees are the last-ditch effort for the various Jewish groups that are there. And they put the question to Jesus about the first and greatest commandment, and Jesus, of course, cites the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and so forth. And when he answers correctly, the Pharisees are effectively silenced. But then what you have, interestingly enough, is now it's Jesus' turn to turn the tables and now ask them a question and see if they can answer. And you have to note the connection here. It's immediately on the heels of this citation of the Shema. Okay, so he's just said, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And now he says, I'll ask you a question, basically. The Messiah, whose son is he? And they say he's the son of David. And then Jesus says, well, then why does David in the Psalms call him Lord? Now remember, I mean, this is Psalm 110, right? And the passage begins, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Notice that in the passage, two persons are being referred to as Lord, right? Yahweh says to my Adonai. And so the point would be, contextually, that while Jesus has rightly answered with the Shema to their question, he's now asking them to explain this further passage, also from the Old Testament, in light of the Shema, right? In other words, the Shema says that the Lord is one, But you also have this statement in a passage like Psalm 110 where two persons are identified as the one Lord of Israel. And so it's simply not true to say that the Shema is a deal breaker for the Trinity. In fact, Jesus appeals to the same Old Testament to show that one is forced into the direction of accepting his lordship.
Yeah, if you notice, David Wood went to the Old Testament as he began his defense for the Trinitarian nature of God, and then worked up through there to the New Testament, which I greatly appreciated and thought he did a good job of that. And, just like Jeff had mentioned, he didn't even get to everything he could. So, Jeff, could you briefly talk about that as far as the defense even from the Old Testament and how David did and what more he could have said? And then, Abu, going to get to you next if you want to tack onto that or bring up a new point. Go ahead, Jeff.
Exodus 16.
Okay.
You have the glory of the Lord, and I'm going to try to turn to it real quick here. I should have had it up. This is one of my favorites, because the glory of the Lord is definitely, if you go to Exodus 40, God present. So when you go to 16, this Bible's getting a little tattered.
While you're looking at that, Proud Somali Muslim says, there is no UN or international law, so conquest is justified to keep your power. Oh, Lord, help us. That scene in New York was not a good scene. This is, I hope that this is not the future of Christian and Islamic dialogue in the United States of America, really for anywhere for that matter. But bringing what's happening on Speaker's Corner to a large platform does not bode well for the future and nature of this discussion. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, so you're going to have to connect Exodus 16:7 with Exodus at the end, where the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle, where they actually worship, and then where the Lord says, I'll dwell among them. But if you look at 7, in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he, you want to get into pronouns here? Here's your complaints against the Lord. So the glory of the Lord, the Shekinah, which is deity, here's your complaints against the Lord. They're being distinguished. They're both deity. What am I going to get from that? You would have to David would have to jump to the end of Exodus to do it, but it wouldn't be hard to prove from one other verse in Exodus corresponding to that verse that you have distinction in deity, and he hears your complaints against the Lord. I defy you to prove to me that electricity hears and understands communication. So I've got personhood, distinction, and deity. It's not a fleshed out Trinity, but it's pretty good fingerprints here. It's pretty good DNA of the Trinity.
That's a good way to put it, and I've heard you put it that way in your talks with the Ministry to Muslims training sessions. The DNA, or maybe even the blueprint or sort of a rough outline, can be found in regards to the Old Testament and even certain faction of Judaism later, but we're not saying it's explicated fully, which David Wood made the point. But again, it makes sense because the incarnation happened in the fullness of time, as the Bible says. So there's a certain point in time where the incarnation happens, and after that, of course, then the Holy Spirit falls upon the early church. So it's later on that this is revealed because of progressive revelation. Now,
here's what it isn't. It isn't Tawheed the way Islam states it.
Right. Yeah, it's not
That's
Tawheed.
the key.
But, there's questions about what is Islamic Tawheed as well. But Abu Kamar, hand it back over to you, my man. New question, new comment, or jump on what we said. It'd be awesome if you want to
jumping on what Anthony brought up about the Shema and what also Jeff brought up about the Shema. I feel that now the debate moves so fast, and like all debates, and that often participants miss what each side is saying. I think a particularly strong point from David's case I love this point. Unfortunately, it went through very quick, and it seemed maybe Mohammed Hijab missed it, and it seemed definitely like a lot of people in the audience missed it. Everybody probably missed it. But at one point, David pointed out the actual structure of the Shema, where it has what could be considered 3 titles of God, or God's name twice, and then of course the title Eloheinu. So you have the Tetragrammaton, Eloheinu, and so there's 3 names and or titles of God, and then the declaration that that's one. So that we're not forced to think of it as unipersonal. We could actually take it as 3 entities being described as one. You have Yah, Eloheinu, Yah. And these 3 are one, that you can interpret Deuteronomy like that. Now, a great point about that is the anticipated response is, well, no Jew understands it that way. You know, this is it's the natural inclination would be to say that what David was proposing in terms of this alternative interpretation of Deuteronomy 6:4 is some sort of wacky Christian innovation. But then he said, I have a commentary on Deuteronomy. He didn't say what that commentary was, but he was quoting from the Zohar, which it's a later text, but it's an authoritative text within Rabbinic Judaism. And he was quoting from Parshat Bo, at least according to, or volume 2 of the Zohar, 43b, if I'm not mistaken. And it makes that point.
Can you define the Zohar? Can you please?
So the Zohar is, according to Orthodox Jewish belief, it dates back to one of the Talmudic sages, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Most non-Orthodox scholars would say, no, this is something, because it only sort of appears on the scene around the 12th century. So they would say, no, it's a medieval text. Whatever the case, it's part of the rabbinic canon now. It's part of the rabbinic corpora. It's a major part of rabbinic Judaism. And but it's not very well known. Not a lot. I mean, people know about it sort of peripherally, but people don't really look at it closely. And within the Zohar, which is what David was quoting, there is a point where it talks about the Shema and asks this question: how can there be three and yet it's one?
Excellent.
And then it provides an analogy. It gives an analogy, and the analogy David didn't get. This is part of the analogy that the Zohar itself gives is of three things being comprised by one thing. It says a voice is one, and yet it has three aspects of fire, breath, and water. You know, I mean, I could go into more, but it was a strong point, and it's one that needs to be fleshed out.
So David is referring to Jewish scholars, and even alluding or sometimes directly referring to Jewish understanding during the era
Jewish commentary, authoritative rabbinic commentary on it.
Just help me out. Anyone here on the panel or anyone in the live chat, did Mohammed Hijab do that?
No.
Did Mohammed Hijab ever do that? Did anyone catch it and I just missed it?
Do
Honestly,
what?
he appeals to stereotypes of Judaism, while David briefly went into the deeper aspects of rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah,
that's the fact of the matter.
Yeah, just
and it was a strong point for David.
Yeah.
In fact, Michael Brown notes that in his Jewish objections, the mystery of the three, which appears in the Zohar.
And what did you guys think of this? The way that Mohammed Hijab tried to use Quranic argument, which I'm gonna be honest, I don't even think he did that great of a job. But he tried to use Quranic argumentation to shut down the doctrine of the Trinity. And you guys might have forgot this quote because it got lost in so much. It was one of the first times I saw, he's riling up the crowd, when he said, "You will see that the Quranic argument will suffocate you." Remember that? that was the first time
I missed that.
I caught an Allahu Akbar from the crowd. He elicited that response by that kind of sort of forceful type language. You will see that the Quranic argument will suffocate you. I don't know if anyone else caught that, but what did you guys think? This is open floor. Of his attempt to use Quranic arguments against the Trinity, which, by the way, I never really saw him use Quranic arguments in defense of Tawheed. But what did you guys think of that attempt? Did you guys catch much of how he employed the Quran?
Yeah, I feel like there wasn't much there, and I don't mean that disrespectfully towards him, but maybe it's because of how fast the debate moved. But I felt like I didn't see a sort of forceful Quranic argument. I mean, he did say at one point that Thalatha. Surah Al-Ma'idah, when it has that thing about the third of three, he said that this refers to all trinities. That it was far from clear to me that that's the intention of the Quranic verse, but whatever the case, the debates move so fast, and there's so much coming up, it's hard for each man to challenge each other on the point. So I felt like there was very little from the Quran.
Okay, well, what about this? And Anthony, you're strong on these. There's a lot of these I want to try to get through, so if you're able to kind of do one-offs, these times where what David brought out, which I think, honestly, I know Mohammed Hijab is like 6'6", but I think this level of argumentation literally went right over Hijab's head. When David brought out the point that Tawheed is not even clearly defined within the Islamic sources, and that there's these confusions regarding what could be looked at multi-personality within Tawheed. Now let's start with those, and maybe just make a quick comment for each one. Anthony, what about the concept that Allah prays, according to Surah 33:56? Do you think that import of that comment was understood?
Well, so I think that I think you could avoid the whole grammatical discussion that things got bogged down into simply by observing the fact that according to Islamic belief, the Quran is eternal, which means a surah like Surah 1 is eternal. But Surah 1, according to Muslims, is a prayer, which means that you have an eternal prayer in the Quran. Okay, this is Allah's eternal speech. And so there is a problem there, right? There's some kind of tension that needs to be resolved.
Okay, hold on. Can you break it down real nice and slow? Why is that a problem? Why is that a tension in the first place? I know what you're saying, but I want to explain this clearly. Why is that a problem?
If you have this eternal prayer, who's this prayer? Who's praying this? Who's it being prayed to?
Right.
I'm not saying nothing can be said here, but I am saying there is at least a tension that needs to be accounted for. And I think that sort of sidesteps the whole grammatical discussion. But and I do think that David made valid points about the fact that Islamic translators like Aisha Bewley, who is a well-respected Arabic scholar, translator, and so forth, that can't just be skirted and brushed aside.
Okay, what about this? What about Surah 28:88, I believe is the correct reference, when David said that basically, according to the Quran and some Muslim scholars, Allah's body parts will die. What about that? I don't think people were understanding the import of these points.
Yeah, I think a lot more could have been said there. Everybody has to choose how much time they're going to spend on something in a debate. And that's one of my favorite areas, and I actually don't think that Mohammed Hijab's response to that was adequate. The fact is that the Islamics are a lot more explicit than most Muslims would like to believe when it comes to Allah's anatomy. My favorite passage to illustrate this is Surah 38:75 of the Quran, where Allah upbraids Satan for refusing to bow down to Adam precisely because he created Adam with his own two hands. Now, this statement is supposed to be making a statement about Adam that makes him unique and sets him apart.
Right.
Okay. If saying he created him with his two hands is something that could be said of everything, well, then you'd have grounds for bowing down to everything, right? But Satan is specifically upbraided for not bowing down to Adam, who was made with Allah's two hands.
Right.
Now, when you look at the Hadith, it gets even more explicit because the Hadith say that Adam was uniquely created with Allah's hands. Other human beings were not. And there are only 4 things in all of creation that were created with Allah's hands.
Right.
Adam, the pen, he planted the Garden of Eden with his hands, and the Torah.
So the point
my point is
Allah's two hands, but I want to keep it moving. I want to get bogged down in some of those details because I got a lot more to throw at you.
Okay, so let me just wrap that up by making this point. The point that David is making is that you do have, in light of that, some kind of plurality to account for. If Allah has two hands, then there's something, you can't just say Allah's one in every respect. Right. You have to say he's one in some respect, but not in another, because he has two hands.
Well, now, in regards to the Quran, and again, please break this down, but let's try to keep it moving because I like this pace. What about this? Sahih Muslim 1874, that the Quran will meet its companion, and David brought this up in the debate. This was never answered, in the form of a pale man on the day of judgment. Can you explain, again, the import of that and why that's relevant to the discussions of Tawheed? Did you catch that? If not, I'm not trying to catch anyone off guard. If you didn't catch that, then we could go to someone else. Anyone on the panel, did you remember when David said that? Comments on the Quran meeting the companion in the form of a pale man.
I do remember him citing that surah and making some points off of it in terms of, and I was trying to understand the exact reasoning behind, but it was essentially that the Quran is being considered a separate personage, and if you then combine that with the Quran being eternal, then you have an eternal personage that's separate from Allah and is still an eternal personage. So
right.
he was trying to demonstrate distinction and some attribute of deity.
And Sam Shamoon and On Answering Islam, as well as Jochin Katz, has an article where they mention some about that. And some of the things that David brought up, such as, this is here... Abu Umma reported, I heard the messenger of Allah saying, read the Quran, for it will become as an intercessor for its reciters on the day of resurrection. And let me find the exact reference here. This is, excuse my pronunciation, Boradeh. I heard the prophet say, the Quran will meet its companion on the day of resurrection when his grave is open for him in the form of a pale man. It will say to him, do you recognize me? He will say, I do not recognize him. It will say, I am your companion, the Quran, who kept you thirsty on hot days, Again, what he was getting at is that Tawheed is confusing in the Quran because of complications such as the Quran itself, which is supposed to be eternal, yet it's uncreated. It's the uncreated speech of Allah, all these things, and yet it's meeting people in the form of a pale man. Abu, any comments on that? If not, we can go to the next one.
Honestly, I'm glad you read that hadith or whatever it was, because that does put it in a different perspective. I mean, it was moving a little too fast for me initially in the debate. So the way I experienced it is David saying, the Quran is going to intercede on our behalf, and then Mohammed Hijab saying, it's your recitation and your good deeds are going to, intercede on your behalf. But now actually hearing the text that you just read, where it's actually going to ask questions and then respond to your responses, that seems to fly in the face of the sort of metaphorical interpretation that he applied to it. That's interesting.
Right. Excellent. So, again, some of this, I think, because things were moving, I think some of this was lost on folks a little bit. That's why we want to do this review. What about the two flocks of birds who will plead on behalf of those who read the Quran? Do you guys remember that? Because it can appear and intercede there for others. And the quote that David Wood gave was, two flocks of birds pleading on behalf of those who read it. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah, I wasn't quite catching how you got from the Quran to or the birds, and the birds were something. I kind of got lost. It was kind of Hitchcocky with the birds.
Well, the basic point is that what you see in certain hadiths regarding the Qur'an, you also find stated in some other ways with respect to particular surahs or even ayahs of the Qur'an, namely that they'll appear in very personal ways, speaking and interceding and so forth for Muslims. And I think that this was probably lost, but I think it's a critical part of that whole argument. But David made the observation that when the pagans referred to the goddess daughters of Allah, whom Muhammad would go on to reject, they are referred to as the high-flying cranes, right? They're referred to as birds because they're able to go up to Allah, fly up to him, and intercede with him. And so David is saying that this is similar to what's being said with respect to these particular surahs. They're being likened to persons who have the ability to intercede with Allah, just like the goddess daughters, who are also portrayed in bird-like fashion.
Again, and so, Anthony, great point. Notice that if you have a God-man who's one mediator between God and man, as Jesus Christ is, then you don't need all this other stuff. Now, let me be a little more precise, because I said the Quran, but it's actually two specific surahs, so I'm glad you brought that up. Let me read the quote here, and this is actually from an Islamic website itself, and here's what it says. It was narrated that Abu Umama al-Bahili, may Allah have mercy on him, said, I heard the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, say, read the Quran, for it will come on the day of resurrection, interceding for its companions. Read the two bright ones, Al-Baqarah and Surat Al-Imran. Again, excuse my pronunciation. For they will come on the day of resurrection like two clouds or shadows, or like two flocks of birds in ranks, pleading on behalf of their companions. Narrated by Muslim 804. Abu Kamara, any comments on that? Because I think what David was getting at is that when you add this all together, the picture of Tawheed in Islam is not as clear as might be advertised.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I'm still processing the previous one, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, what did you think? I think David's point when he brought up the mother of the book, Al-Kitab, such as Surah 6, 101, and something in Surah 13, I think what he was saying there, and it's referred to as being in the presence of Allah, is that if they're going to interpret son, because that's a common contention against the Trinity, if they're going to interpret it literally, then what about interpreting the passage about the mother of the book the same way? And I think that was the point by that sort of. Did anyone catch that? Because I'm trying to do some analysis on some of these things.
And Mohammed Hijab sort of brought up this sort of standard response that he said that sure, you can have, it doesn't all have to be literal. You can have a biological son, an adopted son, or a metaphorical son. And he said, well, the Quran rejects all of those. I don't know. The interesting thing for me that I thought of when that point came up is that, especially in Salafi circles, you get these things where if you ask a question like, what does it mean to say that God has a hand? Is that a metaphor for something? And some Muslims will say, oh, it's a metaphor for X, Y, and Z. But other Muslims will say, no, Allah has a yad, but it's the kayf, the mode of it is unknown to us. It's beyond our comprehension.
So they appeal to mystery, much like they would accuse Christians of doing in regards to the Trinity, I see.
That also comes up with, I think it's Malik bin Anas, when he's asked about istawa, the God mounting the throne or God sitting upon the throne. What does this mean? Because that seems to imply that God has a body. And there's a famous hadith. Malik bin Anas says, he says that the istawa, that it happened, is known, but the kayf, the mode, is not comprehended. But faith in it, iman is wajib. It's obligatory to believe it, even though we don't understand it. Basically, and it says anyone who asks a question but I bring that up because this idea that we have to believe this, but the kayf, the mode, is unknown. I don't understand why, from a Muslim perspective, a Christian can't say that about sonship. Say that sonship, the divine sonship, this idea of the Son who is begotten before all ages. Why can't that be a begetting, the kayf for which is unknown? It's part of the ghaib, the science of the unseen, as they would say. Like if they can appeal to mystery, it begs the question of why we can't do that as well. That this begetting is not part of the three choices he gave. The kayf is simply unknown.
Right. Thank you very much for that. And you mentioned Salafi just now, and earlier I saw a Muslim say, I love how you guys just keep on saying Salafi. You don't even know what it means. So let's define Salafi. And then they said, can you give me an example of Salafi? Well, I'll let you guys define it, but I'm going to be a little bit with a clapback here. Yeah, I'll give you an example of a Salafi Muslim, one I knew personally who is now dead because he went to Garland, Texas to try to kill Robert Spencer because he was hosting a cartoon contest in Texas. His name is Elton Simpson. Now, I knew him by the name he went by when I discussed things at length with him multiple hours at a time. In fact, he gave me my first Quran. Elton Simpson gave me my first Quran as well as my first collection of hadith. A common thing is for a scholar to collect 40 hadith sayings, and that's kind of what they pass on to their students as the essence or significant portions of the hadith. These are things Elton Simpson all explained to me. Who was Elton Simpson? A Salafi Muslim, did not like the term Wahhabist, did not like that at all, said so that's something made up by the Orientalists, and so preferred Salafi or just Muslim, because he thought that was all there could have been to it. But he believed he was doing the right thing. And what did he do? Well, just like, even though it said, hey, I'm not going to go too far afoot, but I'll just put it that way. One Salafi Muslim I knew was Elton Simpson, and you can look him up and my relationship to him if you doubt what I'm saying. But someone quickly define Salafi Muslim for the Muslim audience who brought that up, since you just mentioned it. Abu. Maybe you could define it real quick.
So the Salafi is this term. Sometimes it's self-referential. Sometimes now a lot of people use it pejoratively, almost in place of Wahhabi. The Salafis are called that because they're supposed to be going back to the Salaf, to the original companions, to the first couple of generations. And Mohammed Hijab himself brought that up when he said that Christians sort of anathematized the earliest Christians and then side with the later generations, while we believe that the earliest generations of Muslims were the best, and they got worse from there onward. But the Salafi movement is this sort of almost like a Reformation movement in Islam. It's an attempt to go back to to a pure Islam, the Islam of the first couple generations, the Islam of the Salaf, of the of the companions, and it's now, of course, it's a very diverse movement. But some of the ugliest trends that you see in the Muslim world are more often than not always, but often coming from Salafis. Al Qaeda was a Salafi movement, fell within the Salafi spectrum. Dalat al-Islamiyah, so-called ISIS, they came out of that. Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has written, in my opinion, some of the most frightening literature, is sort of a Salafi movement. And so that's the way I would put it. I would sum it up like this. And if you take just about any negative stereotype about Muslims, about them being violent and all that, and being in favor of conquest, you can probably find a Salafi who corroborates it. I'm sorry, that's really the way it is. I'm willing to give Muslims in general the benefit of the doubt, but I do think there's a lot of Salafis.
That's a funny way to put it.
Most negative stereotypes.
So within that going on, David continued to prod and to poke holes at the concept of Tawheed when he said it seems that the Quran and the sources deify Muhammad. Anthony, could you comment on that when David spoke about people collecting his bodily fluids or follicles and then doing things like rubbing saliva on their faces or drinking Muhammad's blood? Could you comment on that? And again, I don't think everyone quite understood the point. The point is saying that there is a deification aspect of Muhammad, the way he's treated, because that's not, you wouldn't do that to a mere prophet, at least not in the Old Testament, not in any kind of Muslims. Seems like you wouldn't even do that. So he's saying there's a deification of Muhammad even in a certain sense. So again, chipping away at what supposedly this clear concept of the undivisible or indivisible oneness of God. Anthony Rogers comments on that, the blood and the saliva and the hair.
The blood and the saliva and the hair.
Sounds like a great rock band, right?
Yeah, and of course, David was only scratching the surface there when he mentioned those things, and I'm sure that just had to do with issues of time constraints and so forth. The Islamic sources show Muslims fawning all over Muhammad all the time. They would collect his sweat and use it as perfume. They would say that it smelt better than the best of musks and so forth. I mean, honestly, although I'm not trying to be rude here or anything, but I have to imagine that the early Muslims were probably not people you wanted to be around, just in terms of, I mean, think about it. Here they are. They're in the hot desert, right? Sun's baking down on them. They're not only sweating, but they're smearing Muhammad's sweat on them. They're smearing his saliva upon themselves. I mean, it probably reeked to high heaven, honestly.
You did perspiration. We got to come up with a great name for that cologne.
Yeah. And they would also drink his ablution water. David didn't mention that. They would not only try and catch the ablution water, but they would even drink it in certain cases.
For those who don't know, that'd be the water that he would clean himself in.
Yeah, and I have quotes from Muslims. I even have videos of Muslims saying, if I was alive back then, I would do the same thing. And so, while people don't see Muslims doing that sort of thing today, it's in their heart to do that. And, they're the ones who say that Christians go to an excess in their religion. Here's the irony, that what they mean is we unduly praise Jesus. As Christians, we believe Christ is God incarnate, right? So it would almost make sense for us to do something like that, but we don't, right? But here's Muslims saying we don't think Muhammad's anything more than a human being, and yet we do towards him the sorts of things you would only accept if this person was something more than a regular human being.
I got a good name. Instead of Mountain Dew, we'll call it Muhammad Dew. That's the name of the drink. I mean, Mohammed Hijab's response was, "If I spit right now, am I God?" I couldn't catch what he was saying. Remember, he's like, "Ptu, now am I God?"
Well, he was trying to diss David's argument that the amount of reverence given to Muhammad is not proportional to the reverence given to even an Old Testament prophet. Jews didn't run around, collecting Isaiah's spit.
But he was also, with all due respect to him, he was attacking a straw man, to be honest, because David's, as has already been pointed out, David's point was that they're exalting him incredibly by collecting his spit, and somehow Mohammed Hijab reduced the argument to Muhammad's spit, therefore Muslims thinks he's God.
Yes,
and
excellent.
So that's why he was mockingly saying, "I'll spit right now, and will you call me God?" I mean, it was just a bizarre. It was one of the weaker points for Mohammed Hijab. It was a real straw man. He also later on in the debate, when he blew off Benjamin Summer, he blew off the Zohar, and he at some point he told David, you bring these interpretations to any rabbi and they'll spit at you.
Yeah, what's the deal with spit and Mohammed Hijab?
Well, he was bringing it up because David brought it up, but he was bringing it up in questionable ways.
Yes, agreed. So what do you guys think about this argumentation? And again, the way that David was subtly attacking the lack of clarity in the Islamic conception of Tawheed, I don't think anyone ever really understood. I don't think it was really ever clearly understood. I think people actually thought he was off topic. I don't actually think, by the reaction, and clearly Mohammed Hijab, I don't think that was really understood. And I'll give you another example of one. And I use this, actually, I remember in discussions with Elton Simpson, who I brought up earlier, and I remember exactly what he said. He said, well, Muhammad gave Jesus, Isa, Ibn Maryam, as he called him, leave or the allowance to do that. And what am I referring to? Surah 4171 is one place where Jesus seems to be deified in the Quran in a way, and also the account where Jesus Christ is said in the Quran, which of course is derived from non-Christian apocryphal sources, to fashion birds out of clay. And he's saying there you have Jesus as a co-creator. Now, we know the standard Islamic response, but what do you guys think of the actual salience of that as an argument? And there may be a divergence of opinion even on the panel. By the way, real quick before you guys answer that, people who appreciate this kind of discussion, you don't have to be a Christian to appreciate this analysis. Please like this video. We're getting a substantial amount of dislikes, I think sort of just out of spite. Now we have way more likes than dislikes, but if you're enjoying this kind of discussion, no matter what your perspective or opinion is, please like this video. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so, because we do this kind of thing on a regular basis. And also grab this link and share it. We're going to go maybe for about 20 more minutes, and there's some great stuff still coming before we wrap up. But what do you guys think about that, the co-creator idea that he'd say chips away at Tawheed?
Well, I think you can't give the agency of creation to another being. And so, yes, it's a uniquely divine attribute.
Yeah. And let me throw in something here. One of the criticisms that Muhammad often made of the pagans was, remember, the pagans also, many of them, certainly Muhammad's tribe, believed that Allah was the high God. They believed in other gods. Muhammad's criticism of them was not that they didn't believe in Allah, but that they joined together with him in worship these other deities. And parcel of that was the idea that they had intercessory power with him. And so from Muhammad's perspective, for them to share in these sorts of divine attributes or divine functions and that sort of thing, that was committing shirk. Okay, because the pagans weren't saying they're equal to God, but that they shared in his divinity in some way. Right? They had the power to create, they had the power to intercede, they had the power to forgive or what have you. Well, the idea that you can now dismiss the creative work of Jesus mentioned in the Quran on the same grounds that the pagans used to justify their paganism, which Muhammad rejected, well, I mean, there's a fundamental inconsistency in Islam. That's shirk by Muhammad's own definition.
And shirk, everyone, is associating partners in some way with Allah, in a way that it is inappropriate or should not be associated with Allah as the God of the Quran. Now, Abu, you had actually tweeted.
Anthony has brought up a phenomenal point. I've never given this much thought before, but that's a phenomenal point. Like anyone who's debated with Muslims, one thing that you'll find is the whole objective is just to reduce the idea that Jesus is God, that Jesus is equal to God. But they'll even give you the word God. You say you can call him God. He's a lesser God. That's all he is. God with a little g. I mean, even Ahmed Didat pushed that idea for John 1:1. He's a lesser God. He takes part in creation, sure, but he only does it with Allah's permission and so on.
Yeah.
And so when you put it all together, it does start to sound. I've never thought about this before, but Anthony sparked this idea in my mind. It does sound like they're inviting us to something analogous to the religion that's depicted of what's allegedly of the pre-Islamic quote-unquote pagans, the mushrikeen.
My Muslim friends, please stop inviting Christians to shirk. Please stop inviting us to shirk. Now, Abu, you tweeted this, but you haven't really hit on it yet. I really want you to comment on this. I think you're in a good position, and this is one of maybe the last points we'll make about this particular issue, but it's what we've been talking about. You did say David in the debate opened with the proposal that Orthodox interpretation of Tawheed is vastly more confusing than is usually led on. Can you flesh that out one more time? Because you tweeted about it, but I don't feel like you've been able to comment much on it just yet.
Well, the way David himself went through it with it, we've already covered, which is the thing with the birds and all that. But with the way I thought he was going to go with it, and he did briefly get into it, was the fact that the word Tawheed itself is a great deal more nuanced. That has a much wider semantic range than Orthodox Muslims let on. Like when you actually look up the word Tawheed in dictionaries, in literature, the way it's used outside of Orthodox Sunni, Orthodox Muslim circles, just in Arabic in general, you see that it really does mean something different. It does not mean indivisible. It does not mean unipersonal. I've brought this up before. Just look up on the Arabic language Wikipedia, the entry for the reunification of Germany. It uses the word Tawheed. It's, I'adatu Tawheed Almania, the return, literally the return to the Tawheed of Germany. But it means German reunification.
Right.
Tawheed al-Duyun for the consolidation of debts. And so on down the line. The Tawheed does not mean something that does not comprise multiple entities.
So even the word itself is not clearly defined in the way Muslims will define it in a religious context, which is...
And not even Muslims, I would say Orthodox, the so-called Orthodox Muslims. The interesting thing, if you speak with like Alawis or something like that, they'll give you something completely different.
Right.
And it is interesting. It's an artificial limitation on the word that they to sort of support their own doctrine. But it's the word is really a lot more expansive. And this actually brings us back to a point that Anthony brought up in the very beginning, where he talked about Tawheed vis-a-vis monotheism. What I would say, somewhat in contrast to what Anthony was saying, is I would say that, Tawheed, when it's applied to God, is monotheism. But just as there are multiple kinds of monotheism, such as a multi-personal conception of God or a unipersonal conception of God, so too there are multiple conceptions of Tawheed and the Trinity. And this might gain some scoffing from the Muslims who are listening and in the live chat. But the doctrine of the Trinity is a form of Tawheed. As far as, when you apply the word Tawheed to God, it's, the declaration that one God somehow encompasses.
Now, when David was bringing up all those points about confusion within Islam itself in regards to a clear conception of Tawheed, Anthony, you liked the line that David said, Muslim scholars don't let you know this stuff. This is why you find what I'm saying funny. Is that true?
I was actually watching in the comment section, and I saw a lot of Muslims saying, this guy's off his rocker, this guy's crazy, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And Mohammed Hijab kept saying in the debate, sorry, I got a fly flying around here. He kept saying in the debate, 20 years or 30 years of scholarship, and that's what you come with? You don't know what you're talking about. And then David, I think, made a good point there. He says, you guys are laughing. He goes, but I'm reading your sources. These are your sources. Now, I know that Mohammed Hijab doesn't think he's accurately interpreting them and so forth, and you have to get into that whole thing to see whether or not David is making a valid point. But the fact is those things are there. Now, here's where the issue of clarity comes in, because Muslims constantly want to say, oh, this doesn't mean that. Face doesn't mean face, hand doesn't mean hand. Intercession doesn't really mean, that the Quran's going to intercede, all this kind of thing. But the problem is that the Quran, one of its boasts, in fact, Muhammad's boast, the same hadith, by the way, where Muhammad says, I was been made victorious with terror, he also says that Allah has granted me to be the most eloquent person on earth. That's my rough paraphrase. Muhammad claims to be exceptionally eloquent in not only the Quran, but Muhammad claims to be exceptionally eloquent. And the Quran claims for itself that it's the most eloquent book on earth. And part and parcel of that claim of being supremely eloquent is that the Quran is perspicuous. It's clear. Over and over again, you find the Quran saying it's clear, it's exhaustively detailed, it hasn't left anything out, it explains things, it dispels confusion, ambiguity, and so forth. And yet, as soon as you start pointing out some of these things, Muslims have to start saying, well, no, it doesn't really mean that. And often, what the true explanation isn't something that's easily ascertained, right? They go through a lot of reasoning and Islamic sources to try and get you to what they say the real meaning is. It's not a simple thing. And that's why most Muslims don't have the confidence to read the Quran thinking they could understand it apart from listening to their scholars. And so this is my last point on that. But what's interesting is, I find this especially fascinating. Muhammad had been saying that the Quran was clear for 22 years of his quote-unquote prophetic career, until a delegation of Christians from Najran came up to him in the final year of his life and started asking him pointed questions about Jesus. You find this in a number of Islamic sources, including Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, or his life of Muhammad. But he mentions that they come to him, they ask him a series of questions about Jesus based on what he said were revelations, and Muhammad didn't have a quick answer for them. And I won't go through all those questions, but he couldn't answer them, and so he's actually silent, but then he comes back the next day, and his answer is the first 80 verses of Surah 3. Okay, this is according to Islamic scholars. The first 80 verses of Surah 3, And the specific verse that Muhammad has that's a response to the things he couldn't answer is Surah 3, verse 7, which says that there are some things in the Quran that are unclear. They're ambiguous. They're only understood by Allah. Okay? So remember, Muhammad's repeated claim was the Quran is clear. Now all of a sudden he can't answer questions, so he says there's a lot of stuff in the Quran that only Allah knows. Now ask yourself, number one, is Muhammad doing an about-face here? Number two, why is it when Christians are asking him the questions it's suddenly unclear when it had always been clear? Number three, why is Allah revealing stuff that only he knows in the Quran? How is it a revelation if it's not known? And how? And more than that, the verse says that those who try to understand these unclear passages have a diseased heart. But Allah doesn't tell you what verses are unclear in the Quran.
Right.
Which means if you face a verse that you don't know the meaning of, how do you know it's one of the unclear verses and you shouldn't be trying to understand it? Or maybe it's just a verse that could be known.
Yeah.
I mean, you see the problems here. It goes on and on.
Interestingly enough, here in the Study Quran, written by Muslim scholars, when you look at Surah 3:7, it's here at the end of the page, and then the note begins here, and then there's one full page of notes. It's not even any Quranic text right here. It's just notes. And then the next page is also 2 columns, right, just explaining Surah 3:7 alone, and it actually goes all the way into the next page. Now, some Quranic text is on the top of it, but it takes a lot there to just explain the that verse that you just brought up. Now, let's get final debate.
I'm sorry, that was the Study Quran?
Yeah, the Study Quran itself. It has,
by the way, is such a great text in terms of the commentary. I know it enrages certain hardline Muslims, but it's very interesting what that text says about some of the more Trinitarian texts. About it even floats the idea that the Quran's failure to explicitly attack the classical Orthodox Trinity might be rooted in the fact that the authors didn't desire to attack it.
All right, so this is the one last thing I want to get into, and then I'm going to get into final comment, summary, analysis. How did you guys feel when Mohammed Hijab said we should add Satan to the Trinity? After he said we should add Melchizedek to the Trinity and Paul to the Trinity. Thoughts on that?
I had to jump in. His Melchizedek stuff really kind of drove me buggy.
Well, why is that? Why is that, Jeff?
Well, because you're looking at the book of Hebrews, okay, and this is a book of special interest. I mean, it affects my dissertation. It speaks to me on so many levels, and the ridiculousness of pulling a Jewish legal phrase without mother or father, which is a Jewish legal phrase related to genealogy, which I almost wish David Wood had pointed out. It's a very particular phrase. It's indicating there's no genealogy, not that there's eternality there. And he did kind of touch on it. It's in contrast to, is not the same as God being eternal, and it's certainly not the same as adding Satan to the Trinity. It was this really bizarre straw man, ridiculous. Whereas in contrast, if you turn to Hebrews 1, you have no question that these groups of Jews that would never believe this are clearly believing are being told to believe Jesus is God.
Excellent. What about you, Abu, in regards to add Melchizedek? I think he said it 3 times, yelling into the microphone. Add Melchizedek to the Trinity, add Melchizedek to the Trinity, add Melchizedek to the Trinity, and then later on, add Paul and add Satan to the Trinity.
Yeah, I'm at a loss. I didn't understand the Satan thing, and I missed the Paul thing.
Oh, I can explain what he was trying to do. He was saying because they're called God. Somewhere in the text of the New Testament. And so
well, that's the funny thing. It's not, but I guess he's working on a modern interpretation. He probably has in mind 2 Corinthians 4:4. The text doesn't mention Satan, but of course that is a popular interpretation now.
And then he may be thinking there where Paul is called a god by some of the Greeks. That's the only thing I could think of. But I mean how how
he also did that thing with the spirits when David showed that in the Old Testament the Spirit is omnipresent. The Spirit is and in the New Testament the Spirit is omniscient in 2 Corinthians, I believe it is, or 1 Corinthians 2:10, whatever the case. And it's certain. So he says, well, look at this verse that mentions 4 spirits, and so he says,
with the Isaiah, that one really got me.
Why is that?
Zechariah 6:5.
It's sort of a poor argument, what it reminded me of, it's funny because it turns the whole sons by the tons thing, sort of in a different direction. Like,
let me stop there real quick. So Ahmed Deedat influenced a lot of Muslim apologists. South African polemicists used to say God has sons by the tons, and you're referring to that. Go ahead.
So that was Ahmed Deedat's thing. You say he's the son of God, but what about this verse here? What about that verse? Israel's the son, Ephraim's the son, blah, blah. David's the son on a hyper literal interpretation of Psalms 2. So Ahmed Deedat would have that line, God has sons by the tons. And relevant to that, Ahmed Deedat and his crowd, his followers, would always love to point out that later interpretations of monogenes or monogenes, as some say, in John, has no longer been interpreted as only begotten, but just as only or unique. The interesting thing is, if you go that route, these two polemics collide with each other. You say, yes, there are multiple people. The believers in general can be called children of God, but there's a unique son, which is also the point of the parable of the vineyard. Now, once we have that logic before us, it also applies to this thing with the spirits. Yes, there's lots of spirits mentioned throughout the Bible, but just as there is a unique son, different from any other quote-unquote son, so too there is a unique spirit which participates in creation, which is omnipresent, which is omniscient, and so on down the line.
Right, that reminded me.
He also goofed on Ruach.
Oh, yeah, he
goofed on Ruach.
Spirit and all that kind of stuff.
Hold on. Let me hear Jeff, what were you saying?
He goofed on Ruach. He made this point with the Zechariah and the four spirits and said, well, there are two words for spirit, and Ruach is used here. And he tried to make some sort of linguistic point that was really bad Hebrew, and really kind of dumb. I just kind of thought to myself, again, you're committing like first-year Hebrew errors. Ruach is used of wind. It's used of spirit. It's used of human spirits. It's used of God's spirits. You can't make some sort of argument that because the word Ruach is used here, that we're creating a multiplicity of separate persons in the Godhead.
Yeah, misunderstandings of the Holy Spirit abound, such as when the Muslim questioner at one point said, if the Holy Spirit is God, why doesn't he have any authority to speak? Just a total misunderstanding. The point there is that there's a total unison in what the Father and the Son and the Spirit will say. There's no divergence from one. It's tri-unity. And so that's the point. And also there's different roles within the Trinitarian Godhead, right? The Father was not incarnated. That's actually a heresy. The Holy Spirit was not incarnated. So that gets at the point of there's different roles, even though they're co-equal and co-eternal. And David was continually bringing up that point as well. Holy Spirit is eternal, even according to Scripture. Now, do you guys agree? This is our final analysis here with Mohammed Hijab, who said, I think David Wood has said some career-ending, embarrassing things here today. Do you guys agree that this is the end of David Wood's? He's ended his career tonight. Do you agree?
No.
Well, I think
down the YouTube page.
Yeah, when you
now that he has that invitation to repent,
they think that his career's ended because number one, they thought the things that David was saying, they thought they were ridiculous, and David's and that's because, as David was saying, they're not familiar with these things. When they're hearing this, it sounds almost like, this is a joke. And so I think part of what drives that and fuels that is the idea that David is just making these crazy claims up. But the other thing is they're buying into Mohammed Hijab's bombast. They assume that because he was really whipping up the crowd into a frenzy and really tooting his own horn and so forth, that things are as he's saying they are. But saying so doesn't make it so, right? Going back to the MMA analogy, since it's one Hijab likes and he seems to be borrowing from, there are a lot of fighters before fight or even during the fights who make a lot of claims, but we've all seen things turn in a frightfully different direction. I don't know if you guys have seen Anderson Silva. What was that fight? Abu, I think, is a fan of this, where Anderson Silva was over there dancing in front of his opponent. And then he got clocked with a right hand and knocked out. My point is simply to say that the rhetoric has to be commensurate with the substance. If it isn't, then it's all just bluster.
All right, and I think we substantively addressed several of the points that were made and not made today. And let me offer a quick file analysis here. And we don't want this to go too long, so now is the time to do it. Mohammed Hijab's behavior was absolutely deplorable. And if you're a Muslim who believes that your religion teaches high morals, you should not make excuses for it. You should call it out. Also, if you believe that one of the 99 names of Allah, if you're a Muslim, is truth, you need to hold your debaters to those standards and not be fooled by other means. So, rational argumentation, scriptural argumentation, historical argumentation, truth backed up is what you should be looking for, not debate tricks and rhetoric and sophistry and gamesmanship and one-upsmanship, because the crowd seemed to be clearly swayed by that type of thing. If you're a Muslim and the God of that you say you worship is the God of truth, where do just sheer raw naked emotion and verbal jousting, where does that fit in? Because it's clear that it does. Call your dawah proponents to a higher standard. I challenge you. You should be embarrassed by the behavior that took place today. And lastly, ask yourself in your heart of hearts if Tawheed was actually defended. If a clear, cohesive, cogent doctrine of the so-called indivisible oneness of Allah was at any time defined and put forth and then defended, ask yourself if that ever happened, or if someone only attacked something which they clearly did not even understand. That's my final summary. Let's go to Abu. Final summary and analysis, my friend.
Just on the issue of politeness, I mean, I know we covered other passages. One that didn't come up, it's in Surah Al-Furqan. It's 2563, 25th chapter, 63rd verse. It says that the righteous, the servants of the most merciful, when the jahilun respond with insults, they respond to them with salam, which is funny because there's hadiths that some Salafis like to bring up that say that they use as a justification to not even respond with salam when a non-Muslim says salam. But you see here that it's even when they insulted people, they were responding with this in the Quran. So, I mean, that would probably be the right thing to strive for, to respond gently. And to be fair, I think even if people want to say Mohammed Hijab was inconsistent, I nonetheless think that we should all take to heart his challenge for us to keep in mind the implications of 1 Peter. But I think that's a two-way street.
Anthony Rogers, final summary analysis of the debate. Your turn.
Yeah, so I think I've said it several times already. I think there was more rhetoric and bombast than substance. I don't think that he adequately articulated or defended Tawheed. I think he basically takes for granted that Tawheed is obvious, it's clear, and doesn't really need to be explained or defended. I do think that David did raise issues that he should have taken more seriously. I think that it's a good strategic move to pretend like there's nothing there to really answer. And that's what allowed him to pretend like he's answered David in 3 minutes, because all he's really doing is just saying, I don't need to answer that. I don't really need to deal with that, and that sort of thing. So I don't think he did an adequate job in presenting and defending the Islamic doctrine of Tawheed. When it came to answering David on the Trinity, I think that he skirted a lot of things that David brought up. And again, he was able to give the impression that he was able to answer David in less time than he was even allotted. But that was just an illusion created by the fact that he just skirted a lot of things.
David, I'm glad you brought that up. Excellent.
Yeah,
excellent.
David mentioned a lot of points. There's always stuff that you might want somebody to say, and everybody's got to choose in a debate what they're going to focus on and so forth, and that's just the nature of debate, and it's a limitation imposed on both people. But I think that when you get down to brass tacks, when you look at the issues that were raised, Let me throw in one other thing as an example of what I just thought was completely inadequate on Hijab's part. He responded to Matthew 28:18 through 20, the Trinitarian baptismal formula instituted by Christ. He tried to respond to that by appealing to Luke 9:26, where three are mentioned: the Father, the Son of Man, and the angels. Right, but the passage says that the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Okay, he wanted to say that if Matthew 28:18 through 20 proves the Trinity, then this proves another kind of, plurality. But that's comparing two very different things. Jesus is not there articulating the nature of God. He's not saying people are to be baptized into the name of the Father, the Son, and the holy angels. Matthew 28:18 is in a category all its own, right? It's the initiatory rite of Christianity. This is how a person is formally inducted into the church, right? And so you have something very different going on in Matthew 28. So anyways, I don't think Abu did an adequate job, though I do think he was...
Abu's our friend here on the panel. You mean?
I keep calling him Abu.
We really got to wrap up, though, Anthony. You're kind of...
Okay,
I love you, but you're going into a new point. You're kind of...
Anthony,
yeah, I got lots more points.
I know, and I appreciate that. But that reminds me, and Jeff, I'm coming to you next. I've given you the most time to
Sorry,
think
Abu.
there. Check this out. I have been granted a post-debate interview with David Wood. And it's going to happen within the next 2 to 3 days on this channel, where you're going to hear straight from the horse's mouth, as it were, his reaction and reflection on the debate. So you get the inside scoop there from David. We're still working out the details. We were going to try to do it tonight, but there's an internet problem at his hotel. By the way, I think it was a false premise that they said the internet there could only support one. It was supposed to be on David's channel, but they only put it on Mohammed Hijab's channel. Nonetheless, that's what happened, but I am going to be interviewing David very shortly. So pay attention to this channel next 2 or 3 days. Subscribe. Even if you don't like me or you don't like this channel, subscribe at least for the next 2 or 3 days and get the notifications. Then you can unsubscribe when you're done, okay? It's like a magazine. You can cancel. But you want to catch this. It's going to be very insightful. Jeff Cran, final debate, analysis, summary, my man.
I think one of the things to me is I looked at the content was supposed to be Tawheed versus the Trinity. And the attack on the Trinity was extremely poor, ununderstood. I mean, what I got out of that from that position was it wasn't Tawheed versus the Trinity. It was Tawheed versus the misconception of the Trinity.
Right. Tawheed never defined or defended versus a misconception of the Christian Trinity. Excellent.
Attack the Trinity and Tawheed wins by default.
Right. Whatever Tawheed is, because it was never clearly defined or defended. But go ahead. Sorry, we're interrupting you because you made such a great point there, Jeff.
And then the other point is, and I would encourage it, regardless of the bombast, if you're going to play by the rules, you're going to call someone to account to languages, you might want to look up a few Hebrew words before you pull it.
Excellent advice. And in the words of Hijab, just slightly translated, a little bit different paraphrase, I knew we were going to have to give you a free Hebrew lesson today. Now, with that, let me say the final thing. Listen, there was a lot of great comments. There's a lot of great people in the live chat. I'm sorry I could not get to all of you. It's just not possible on a broadcast like today. I want to thank Anthony Rogers. I want to thank, I know I give you a hard time, but you're my boy, homie. I want to thank Anthony Rogers. I want to thank Jeff Cran and Abu for being willing to do this on short notice. We initially didn't plan it, but it was sort of during the debate we realized we need to do this. I want to thank everyone who joined here today. And I also want to let you guys know that we have a thing on the channel where when we go over 100 viewers, I do a freestyle. However, because of the nature of the subject and because of the length of this particular discussion, I'm going to postpone it. And I'm always faithful with my audience. You can ask them, right? Whenever we do something and we have to delay it, it's like a rain check, but I'm going to come through. So on one of the next 2 broadcasts, because I don't know if I'm going to get to it on the David Wood interview, I will do the freestyle because we got over 100 viewers on this particular show. So stick around for that, and we will do it, and we'll be over one of Jonathan Soko's beats because he provided me with some brand new dope beats, and he's a faithful supporter. Thank you to the rest of those faithful supporters. We got Warrior Woman. I don't know if I saw Roxby. Lily, who was there in person all the way from the Bronx. Yep, there is Roxby. Some other people. What do you mean? Thanks for joining. Just some awesome people. check out the video if you haven't already seen it, and take notes and actually pay attention to what's being said, not just the rhetoric. If someone wants to make a final thing right here, I'll let you, but I'm about to hit end broadcast. Does anyone else have a burning thing on their heart they needed to share? Anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I always have.
you always got something?
Yeah. Well, one other thing, there's actually, I have a dozen things here, but one of the things that was interesting is he said that Augustine had to butcher John 17:3 and rearrange the words in order to make it comport with the doctrine of the Trinity. I had ready here his book on the Holy Trinity, in which he cites John 17:3 no less than 3 times in the exact word order that it appears in the text, in the Greek text. So, anyways, there were a number of errors that he made that were just too many to count.
I got you. Well, thanks, guys, again for joining. Thanks for coming through. And I'm going to close with a beat by Jonathan Soko. And be sticking around to the channel. You do not want to miss this David Wood interview. All right, y'all. God bless. See ya. It's been a wonderful night. Peace out. Shalom. Jonathan Soko, thanks for the beat, bro.